Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today to discuss China's food security. So trends in demand for food are growing faster than yields are. By 2050, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that 60% more food per year will be needed to support the growing global population. At the same time, the climate is changing, creating further need for agriculture to adapt. On top of this, the incidence of African swine flu on the global pig population and COVID-19 on the human population have disrupted supply chains and put extreme pressure on producers. As Jane Goodall, the world-famous primatologist and conservationist, said this month, if we do not do things differently, we are finished. So finding ways to respond to these challenges is a key global priority, and I am very happy that we are joined today by three experts in this field who can hopefully shed some light on China's food security situation. So we have Seth Cook, an associate at the Food and Land Use Coalition in London. Seth oversees the transformation of food systems in India and China and has lived many years in China working with WWF China and the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Next, we have Darin Friedrichs, the Senior Asia Commodity Analyst from INTL FCStone in Shanghai. Darin researches agricultural commodity trading in the region, in particular with grains and soybeans. And finally, we welcome Doris Lee, the Principal Consultant at GFIC Consultancy, Beijing. Doris works on plant-based and cellular agricultural food innovation, helping to develop sustainable alternative proteins. So thank you all for joining from across the world. And very quickly, for those not familiar with YCW, we are a volunteer organisation with 10 chapters around the world, focusing on delivering events, talks, networking and mentoring opportunities for young professionals interested in deepening their knowledge of China and its place in the world. This is the third instalment of YCW London's Climate Series. We kicked off 2 weeks ago with an interview with Barbara Finnemore, the Asia Director of the National Resources Defence Council, and last week we held a panel discussion on China's latest wildlife reforms. For today's session, all audience members are automatically muted, but please feel free to submit questions along the way via the Q&A button, and we will get to them after the speakers have shared their views. And this session will be recorded and made available on our website in a few days. So to start us off today, I'd like to ask Seth, can you please explain a little bit about the state of food security in China and what has been the impact of coronavirus? Has it exposed or exacerbated any vulnerabilities?
Thanks, Cameron. Good morning, everyone. So I'd like to thank the Young China Watchers, first of all, for organizing this panel. I've attended a lot of Young China Watchers events in recent years, and it's an honor and privilege to be part of this one on a very timely subject. So in my talk today, I'd like to cover several key topics related to food security in China. But before I do that, let me say a bit about FOLU. So Food and Land Use Coalition, or FOLU for short, was launched in 2017. And it's a coalition of 9 organizations that seeks a transformation of the world's food and land use systems to better protect our natural environment, provide nutritious and affordable food, and meet the SDGs in the Paris Agreement. And it's composed of 4 parts. The first being the Secretariat, of which I am a part, and that's based in London. The second is the Core Partners Group that provides strategic leadership and oversight of the coalition's activities and is composed of 9 organizations. The third, we have FOLU ambassadors, who are high-level leaders in academia, government, business, finance, and civil society, and they serve as champions of food and land use system transformation in key ways. And the final component of FOLU is the country platforms, which encourage coordinated action at the national level and are now in place in Indonesia, Colombia, Ethiopia, and most recently in India and China, and those are the 2 platforms that I am responsible for. And in China, we established a platform in 2019, and we have a core group of partners that includes China Agriculture University, Chinese Academy of Sciences, the Tsinghua SDG Institute, World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and WRI China. And our main priorities for the present period are, number 1, healthy and sustainable diets. So that's relevant for this, very relevant for this talk. Sustainable agriculture, food loss and waste, greening China's international soft commodity supply chains, and lastly, the development of long-term integrated models of food and land use systems in order to assist planning processes. So I want to delve into food security in China, but let me say something about what the term means, first of all. So the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, or FAO, defines food security in terms of 4 components: availability of food, access to food, utilization, and stability. And my talk today is really going to focus on the availability and access parts. So now on to food security in China. This is a really complicated topic that I'm only going to be able to treat in a very cursory way. Luckily, we have Doris and Darin to talk about other aspects of the topic. Given the fact that we're in the midst of the COVID epidemic, which originated in China, of course, I want to talk a little bit about that and its influences on food security. So there's an excellent book by someone named Sulman Wasif Khan called Haunted by Chaos: China's Grand Strategy from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping. And you might use a similar phrase to describe China's approach to food security, namely haunted by famine. China is a country that's known many famines in its long history. The most recent and devastating of all occurred during the Great Leap Forward between 1959 and 1961, when upwards of 30 million people died of starvation and related causes. Frank Dicatur, in his book, Mao's Great Famine, estimated that the death toll has actually reached some 45 million, which is a staggering figure. So for the Chinese, food security and food shortages are not academic topics, but one which ordinary people are acutely aware of, since so many people alive today lived through the lean years of the Great Leap Forward. And it's therefore no wonder that the Chinese government has always prioritized food security and still does. And I remember a WeChat conversation with a Chinese friend in March when the coronavirus was really starting to hit Western countries, triggering panic buying in many places. And we were both incredulous about people in the UK and the US fighting over toilet roll in supermarkets. You know, it's something that makes no sense to Chinese people who would prioritize always on stocking up on food. So on the whole, with the notable exception of the late 1950s and the early 1960s, China's done a really admirable job of feeding its 1.4 billion people on only 9% of the world's arable land, especially when you compare the recent record with China's imperial past when famines were common. So the high priority placed on food security by the government has paid off. That said, there is still undernourishment in China today, particularly in the western parts of the country. About 8.5% of the population is undernourished, and 8% of children suffer from stunting or low height for their age. That's actually fairly low. Those figures are fairly low for the developing world. An even bigger problem, though, in China today is overnutrition. So some 32% of the adult population in China are overweight and 7% are obese. And this is really very much a product of dietary change over the past 3 to 4 decades. So increased prosperity, urbanization, rapid social change have seen many Chinese people shift from traditional diets that were high in fiber and fresh vegetables to increased consumption of meat, ultra-processed foods, and fast foods. Meat consumption, just to take one of those items, in China has soared since the 1990s and was 3 times greater in 2018 than 1991. So pork remains the most consumed meat in China, accounting for 62% of total meat consumption in 2018. Per capita pork consumption is ranked #1 globally since 2008, surpassing the US and Switzerland. And beef consumption per capita in China is 7 times greater now compared to 1990. Not surprisingly, diet-related diseases are rising. So 89% of deaths in China are caused by what's called non-communicable diseases, or NCDs. And over 45% are diet-related NCDs, like diabetes, cancer, heart disease. 9% of the population suffers from diabetes. Food loss and waste is also a significant problem. Consumers in China's big cities alone waste enough food to feed between 30 and 50 million people. So in China and globally, food security is usually thought of in terms of cereals. And China has maintained a self-sufficiency rate in the major staples of wheat and rice of around 95%. And planned grain imports for 2020 represent only 3% of China's annual grain consumption, meaning that China is about 97% self-sufficient in terms of the 3 main cereals consumed, like wheat, rice, and maize. We can debate the merits of that. In my view, it's a smart move. To illustrate why, just consider the fact that the total amount of rice traded on the international market in 2018 was an estimated 46 million tons, according to the FAO, whereas China's domestic consumption of rice in the same year was estimated at 151 million tons. So in other words, China's rice consumption is 3 times greater than the total amount of rice traded on the international market. So even if China were to buy up all the rice in the market, it would only cover about 1/3 of its demand. So it is very important for China to be basically self-sufficient in staples. That has a cost too, which we can discuss. And China's also maintained substantial grain reserves and has built facilities across the country to store rice, wheat, maize, and soybeans. And it has sufficient reserves today to meet its internal demand for about a year. So how has China fared in terms of food security during the COVID-19 period? Well, the situation has stabilized in recent months, but there were severe disruptions to food supplies and the economy in China in the initial period of the crisis. So the outbreak began in December 2019, but the impact really wasn't felt until January 23rd when the lockdown was declared in Wuhan. And this occurred just before the Chinese New Year. And that's quite significant because traditionally, producers, processors, resellers, wholesalers, even individual household families store up food for at least 2 weeks during that prior to the New Year's event. So the immediate impact of COVID was rather small. But as more provinces began to introduce lockdowns, physical distancing, and restrictions on the movement of people and food, the whole of February was really the most difficult month in China in terms of people's livelihoods and economic activities. And to ease that disruption to the food system, the government has taken a number of measures, one of which has been one of the most effective, is establishing green channels for the transportation of agricultural products and inputs. So to make sure that the inputs, the workers, are not hindered in their movements to where they need to go. So vehicles transporting those supplies are allowed through a green channel when passing COVID-19 checkpoints or toll stations. And drivers hold a pass issued by provincial governments, which allows transit without being requested to park, pay fees, or be inspected. And then the staff at the checkpoint also help with the disinfection of vehicles to ensure a fast and safe transportation. Once they arrive at the destination, like the driver's temperature was measured, visitor information is logged, and the vehicles are disinfected. So that's how entrance is allowed. Several measures that China took was promoting financial services in rural areas to facilitate the availability of credit, and also market creation, such as organizing video conferences with participants from both production and sales bodies to facilitate deals. So the situation today, and Doris and Darin, being based in China, you're more kind of your feet are on the ground, know more about this than I do. But from what I've read and understand, talking to colleagues, the readily availability of sufficient food stocks now has helped to keep food availability and prices fairly steady. Similarly, the gradual return to normalcy in most parts of the country seems not to have affected overall food production and distribution that much. However, loss of employment resulting from movement restrictions, along with the consequent loss of income, has reduced some people's ability to purchase food, even if food is actually available on the market. So purchasing capacity rather than food availability may be the biggest threat to food security in China today. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Seth. That's a really comprehensive overview of the state of food security right now in China, and very interesting to hear about the measures that the government's taking to help keep that moving in terms of those green channels for transportation as well. So turning now to Darin, we'd love to hear about your work in Shanghai and what insights you can share about food security from your point of view of the grain trade. And perhaps you might be able to touch on the impacts of the US-China trade war or trade negotiations over soybeans and how that's been used as a bartering tool.
Yep, definitely. Thank you so much for having me. So a bit about myself. I currently work for a company, INTL FCStone, which is a sort of global brokerage company based out of the US. And then I've been living in China, working in agriculture for a while now. So I guess to start off with, we need a background of basically how Chinese agriculture is different from the rest of the world. When China joined the WTO, they got what's called a tariff rate quota system, where the government could basically set, how much corn, wheat, rice, and products could come in. A lot of this is assigned to the government. And this has ultimately led to sort of a different market domestically within China, sort of versus the rest of the world. So, for example, right now, because of these limits, you have corn prices in Chicago or on the global market that might be around $3 a bushel, whereas in China, they might be closer to $7 or $8. And the same thing is happening with sort of soybean prices, where the domestic market within China right now is incredibly strong, nearly $20 a bushel, while US farmers are looking at maybe $9 a bushel. So there's always been a lot of control over what comes into China and how that works within the tariff rate quota system. Now, up until recently, a lot of these quotas were never filled. The government is supposed to allocate a certain number of million tons per year under the WTO agreement, but due to how that was administered, a lot of it just never got to companies. Either there was logistical problems or bureaucratic problems, all this kind of stuff prevented the quotas from getting filled. Last year, we saw an important WTO case, which was actually the US versus China regarding how these tariff rate quota systems were administered. And basically, the US said, your obligation under the WTO is to assign these quotas and to do it transparently. And China lost on a lot of the counts under the WTO case. But additionally, we've also had the phase one trade deal. One of the big things in the phase one trade deal was that China was going to improve how it issued these quotas. Now, it depends on the commodity. For something like wheat, 90% of that is allocated to COFCO, or the state-owned enterprise of China. It's sort of a government-owned company. So they get 90% of this quota where they can use to buy it. For corn, it's a little bit different. For corn, it's 60%. And so private companies are, in theory, supposed to be able to sort of apply for this quota, get it, and then go out on the open market. And they could buy American corn, perhaps Ukraine corn. And given the price differences, they would make quite a bit of money importing this and bring grain into China. Now, the problem is that this has historically not really worked that effectively. Companies had to apply in advance. They had to have plenty of sort of approvals. They would often get assigned levels that are not economically viable. So the grain trade works basically at scale. If you, for example, want to buy corn from the United States right now, you're going to put it on what's called a Panamax boat, or a boat that holds about 60,000 metric tons. And if you do that, you can get very cheap freight rates. And this might be something around $14, $15 per ton to ship an entire ton of grain from, let's say, New Orleans over to China. Now, the problem that comes in here is that if you apply for these tariff rate quotas and the government gives you 20,000 tons, then you're in a difficult situation. If you get a smaller boat, that's going to be more expensive. If you try to use containers, that's going to be more expensive. So a lot of these firms would sort of avoid the system altogether because it was a bit of a gamble. If they didn't get the amount that they wanted, they would be in a tough position. And the way that it was administered, if they got a quota and they did not use it, then they would have to pay some penalty or sort of be out of the system going forward. So we're seeing there's trying to be some reform in this system. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is because of the system, China originally set it up for the main commodities, sort of the iron rice bowl, the corn, rice, and wheat. Now, of course, there's many other grains in the world and a lot of enterprising traders. So what we saw was a lot of people in previous years imported sorghum, they imported barley, they imported alternatives like distiller's dry grain, cassava, all these things. Just because even though they're not the ideal ingredients, the price spread is so big inside of China versus outside of China that they still made imports of those. But let's talk about soybeans, because those are sort of the big topic, especially under the trade war. China was traditionally a very big producer and even an exporter at some point. But in the mid-90s, China was sort of liberalizing. They needed to bring in grain. And like Seth said, they wanted to keep self-sufficiency in grain. Now, soybeans are typically used for animal feed, for pork, and that's more of a luxury product, especially when you consider the 1990s sort of Chinese diet. China made a strategic decision to keep producing domestically the main stuff that humans eat. So that's going to be corn, it's going to be rice, and that's going to be wheat. And they said, okay, we're going to import soybeans because we're going to use this to feed pigs. And if we have some trouble, we lose some pigs, but we still have food in our own hands. So we saw a large growth in imports over the last couple of years, and this has led up to China being the biggest importer in the world. And currently, China is importing about 95 million tons per year. Now, again, most of this is not for human consumption. China grows its own soybeans domestically. These are used for tofu and other soy products for human consumption. There's a very separate market for imports, and those imports come from the United States and from Brazil. There's a small amount from Argentina, but generally speaking, Brazil and the US provide all of China's imported soybeans that are used to feed the pigs here, and that's very important for food security within China. Now, under the trade war, that messed some things up. China exports a lot to the US, but China imports very little from the US, and most of what it does import of value is agriculture, specifically soybeans. Now, under a normal situation, China buys about half from Brazil, half from the US. And normally, China would not be able to just shun the US and avoid US soybeans. But around the same time, we had African swine fever, which has been very terrible for the pork industry, but gave China flexibility when it came to where to import soybeans from, because there's less pigs, so less pigs that need to eat. So China sort of was able to go through 2018 without really buying much soybeans from the U.S. They bought a lot from Brazil, and that distorted prices quite a bit, where Brazilian prices were incredibly expensive and the U.S. was relatively cheap. But they sort of made it through without needing to buy too much from the U.S. This year, we're seeing much more buying from the U.S. as things try to normalize a bit. Now, within that, China obviously grows its own soybeans, but relatively small amounts, maybe 15 to 20 million tons versus the 95 million tons that China sort of imports. Now, China has obviously tried to switch that. They've tried to increase their production domestically, but it's very difficult. Part of that is that for many years, the government has subsidized corn production in the Northeast, and it's very hard to just flip a switch and change to soybean production. A lot of the subsidies, a lot of the equipment, a lot of the supply chains are all geared towards corn, and it's a difficult change to make. Additionally, China just doesn't have that much land available. So if they do switch to soybeans, that's going to take land away from corn. So last year and the year before, we saw massive subsidies for soybeans to try to encourage production. And this year we've seen a reversal. Where many of the governments where the Ministry of Agriculture and others have said, we need to stop the decline in corn production because we need corn. So it's a tough balancing act for China right now. Now, under the phase one trade deal, basically it was honestly just unrealistic from the get-go. The numbers that they were throwing out were really not possible nor plausible. And the reason for that is that, generally speaking, with agriculture, you can fit things into two very broad baskets, right? So that's going to be stuff that the animals eat. So that's going to be soybeans, corn, things like that. So we could import that into China and then feed that to pigs or feed that to chickens or feed that to beef domestically and then grow the meat here. Or the other basket is that we import meat. So China imports pork or chickens or seafood or whatever from globally. But you can't really do both, because if you're importing the feed, then you're going to grow the animals domestically. If you're importing the meat, then you have no need for the grain. And the problem with the phase one trade deal was that you had to sort of assume that China was going to have this massive increase in consumption, where China would need to import both massive amounts of grain to feed the animals, but also massive amounts of animals as well. So it wasn't very realistic from the get-go. Now, under the trade deal, there's been a bit of a disconnect. Part of the problem is that the U.S. has basically wanted this trade deal because, in part, they think that the government is too involved in commercial decisions. And at the same time, the U.S. has also wanted China to use that power to do massive imports. So there's a bit of a contradiction in how that works. So the U.S. wants China to liberalize the market so that commercial players in China can go and import all this U.S. product. But at the same time, there's an underlying tone of China should order COFCO and other state-owned enterprises to do massive imports. And that's become a bit of an issue. So far, we haven't really seen the Chinese government really demanding that the firms buy US products. Most of the stuff that's been done under the Phase 1 trade deal of China has been liberalizing the market and increasing market access. So that's included things like US meat, it's included things like US dairy products or infant formula, and it's included things like reforming the TRQ system so that these commercial players in China can have the option to sort of go out and buy American products, or that the US products can compete. In the past couple of weeks, we've seen quite a bit of swings politically. So about 3 weeks ago, Bloomberg reported that China was ordering state-owned enterprises to stop purchases of US soybeans and other agricultural products due to the US policy positions on Hong Kong. But then just after this recent Hawaii meeting between the diplomats, then we got the opposite headline that China was going to ramp up purchases. So I think we're in a bit of a, we're sort of all sort of in the dark as to what's going on now. China does seem to want to comply with the Phase 1 trade deal. But again, the volumes are unrealistic, so we don't know how that's going to play out. Now going forward, I think one thing to remember is the importance of the reserves, like Seth mentioned. China had been trying to sort of get rid of some reserves. Over the past couple of years, they've been trying to sort of wind at least some of the temporary large reserves down. And I think this sort of coronavirus scare has scared a lot of people within China. China relies incredibly heavily on imported soybeans, and Brazil and the US are the #1 and #2 places where COVID-19 is breaking out in the world. And there's been a lot of fear domestically that if they're going to do lockdowns, if there's going to be a lot of sick people, how are we going to get these soybeans if our two major suppliers are the two major hotspots in the world? Now, so far, we haven't seen much logistics disruption. Everything has sort of flowed normally. But of course, people are in the background are worried about this. And I think it's going to sort of bring forward another revitalization in China of the importance of these food reserves. And China is also going to continue to diversify. This has been something that's been happening over several years, but I think COVID-19 will accelerate this. China realizes it's very dependent on the US and Brazil, and is going to continue to try to find new sources. Recently, it's been Argentina approved for sorghum and barley, as well as just a handful of Belt and Road countries that have gotten approvals. But this is going to be an accelerated push where China is really going to try to make sure they're not reliant on just any one country or region for their food security going forward. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Darin. That's a really useful and clear breakdown of the grain imports in China and where they're coming from, what they're used for, and their relative importance in sort of the recent political swings. And it is interesting thinking about food security and the diversification that China is going to undertake through that. I think that rings true for a lot of countries around the world, thinking about their relationship with China and their imports as well, and the way I like in the UK, the push to sort of diversify our trade relationships too. So it's quite a very interesting breakdown of that. But we'll turn now to Doris for a slightly different angle. Doris, would you be able to tell us, first of all, what are alternative proteins and how are they made? And what trends have you observed through your work in helping to promote their development? Are consumers interested in them?
Sure. I hope you can all listen to me clearly. So hi everyone, I'm Doris from GFIC and Grace from Beijing. And first of all, I have to say that I'm amazed by how Seth and Darin can go so deep into the topic in only 10 minutes. I try to do my best to cover key points and introduce you what alternative protein is. So I guess many of you have either heard of or tried plant-based meat, but might not be very familiar with the term alternative proteins. So lately, more plant-based and cultivated meat companies internationally are now creating meat from plants and growing it directly from cells. That is giving consumers everything they like about meat, including the taste, the texture, and so on. But without clearly the external cost of conventional animal meat. So these alternatives to conventional meat and even dairy and egg products are what we call alternative proteins. So there are certainly a few like potential benefits of like plant-based and cultivated meat that consumers now are eyeing on or are being attracted to these products. So for example, plant-based and cultivated meat could be a more sustainable way to consume protein, including, for example, less greenhouse gases emission and more efficient use of water and land resources. And just now, Darin talked about like China being the great exporter of soybean. Is also like plant-based meat is based a lot on soya as well. But then producing plant-based meat can be a more efficient way to use soybean than using it as feed first, because of the high energy conversion of feed to animals than to produce meat. And also there could be less like pollution and antibiotic resistance. So who is meat alternative or alternative proteins made for? It's not just for people that are vegan, vegetarians, or already adopting a plant-based diet, but is marketed for everyone, including meat eaters. That's why it's very important for meat alternative proteins to taste as close to meat as possible. So so how is alternative proteins being perceived in China? So as Seth already mentioned, China is the biggest market in the world for meat. And as demand for meat is projected to increase, so alternative proteins has high potential to actually fill the discrepancy between supply and demand in a highly efficient way than just relying on animal agriculture. So we can see that both plant-based and cultivated meat companies have clearly put their eyes on China because of the huge market potential and the projected needs. For example, this March, when COVID is more or less stabilized in China, we have seen major moves on launching plant-based meat products. For example, in the major chains, from KFC to Pizza Hut to Starbucks, and all these products are being marketed with a clean and rather healthy image. A few global plant-based trendsetters like Beyond Meat and Just, they also have been like really focused on expanding the operation in China now, and both of them have already actually entered. And then there are, of course, also homegrown entrepreneurs and companies that are launching more products more or less around like since late last year and like earlier this year, and they are expanding across mainland China right now. And of course, players including the biggest conventional meat companies in the world, like Cargill, they are launching a full plant-based product line in China, supposed to be this month. And also lastly, the world's largest food company is opening a plant-based meat plant, plant-based food factory also in Tianjin. As for consumer acceptance, which is the key, so right now we have seen a few consumer surveys that are launched after around like March, after the outbreak. So we have seen that consumer awareness on food safety in relation to conventional meat has actually increased. And also there are consumer research done by, for example, the Good Food Institute and others have shown that like Chinese consumers are even more enthusiastic about plant-based and cultivated meat than US consumers. But of course, there are like unique challenges. For example, we all know that Chinese consumers, including myself, are very particular about taste, and we might have different motivation to purchase these alternatives than, for example, like Western consumers, like the US consumers. For example, we might look more on health than, for example, like environmental impact of the product that we are purchasing. And of course, these are areas like, for example, like that what I mentioned, like taste, areas for companies and scientists to work on to improve their products, to appeal more to local Chinese consumers. So a little bit about what we are doing as GFIC. So GFIC is a China-based consultancy focused on accelerating the development of local alternative protein industry. So apart from providing consultancy startups and companies that are focused on the Chinese market, we also collaborate with universities, scientists, companies, and investors to support both plant-based and cellular agriculture food innovation in China. We are currently building a platform of industry and R&D resources on alternative proteins, including publishing quality reports and key curated news for local audience, because we see that accessing really quality news and content is still one of the bottlenecks that is the industry is seeing. And also, we just published a report on sustainable seafood alternatives on the World Oceans Day, which we think could be a wide space for China because of the huge demand for seafood in China. And also we work with, like, for example, incubator to support local entrepreneurship. We hope to, by all this, we hope to increase the awareness on the importance of alternative protein and allowing interested people to gain an in-depth understanding of the opportunities and, of course, the challenges of this industry. And next, we are planning to support local scientists and increase cross-border exchange and collaborations. We are a very small and dedicated but growing team, so we don't cover everything.
I think you might have slightly frozen there and lost in the ether. What we might do is just let your computer refresh a bit, and we might move on to the Q&As for now, and then come back to you, Doris, so you can finish what you were talking about there. So to all the audience, please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function, and we will start to ask those to our speakers. So we've got one in so far from Björn. Thank you for the presentations. Can the speakers also comment on China's fisheries policy with regard to food security? It would also be great to hear about its distant water fleet that is fishing marine biological resources around the globe, both on the high seas and in other states' national waters. I'm wondering if anyone has experience on that. Perhaps I can go to Seth. No, not sure.
I can give a sort of high-level overview, I guess. You know, I mean, aquaculture is a really big part of the Chinese industry, and there's basically split up, like the person said, into sort of a domestic aquaculture industry, which is going to be things like fish or shellfish domestically grown inland. But then China also has a very large sort of fleet globally that goes out and does pretty extensive fishing. And this is, you know, this has been very important to food inflation and keeping sort of food prices down and keeping the market supplied. And China, the government has sort of indirectly subsidized this in large part due to sort of things like diesel subsidies, where they can send these fishing fleets all the way over to, you know, the South Atlantic and things like that. But it's also got a very political dimension because these are often fleets that sort of get into scuffs with the local nations that they're dealing with. So I think it was about a year or two ago, there was actually a Chinese fishing vessel in Argentina that the Argentine Navy or Coast Guard actually had to sink. So it causes some political tension, but at the same time, you know, I mean, protein's important and seafood's important, and the government's been subsidizing it. And yeah, I mean, they've obviously been trying to build up the domestic industry for inland growth and things like that. And, you know, if you go up to, let's say, Dalian or some of these coastal areas, there's obviously large fish farms and aquaculture farms up there. But for the foreseeable future, the deep water sort of long distance fishing is still very important.
Wincy asks, why doesn't China have the capacity to produce crop and poultry, so soybeans and poultry or pigs at the same time? Yes, the population has been surging, but for such a massive country with advanced farming technologies, I find it hard to imagine that they can't do that. And I think, Darin, you spoke a little bit about how that relationship works in terms of trade, but are there more explanations in terms of the technology, or is it a matter of space?
It's sort of a matter of both. I mean, China's obviously a very dense country, so there's not really much sort of arable land to use right now, where we can just sort of increase the basis. So that's why we've seen in recent years there's been a lot of expansion into Siberian Russia, where there's been these soybean farms that go across the border in Heilongjiang up to Russia just to get them more land. The other thing to consider is that, China's been trying to do land reform for 20 years now. A lot of the land is still owned by smallholders. It's still relatively unmechanized. There would be huge efficiencies to be gained if they could sort of group this land together and run it like Brazil or the US or Europe. But land reform is a pretty intractable problem that the government's been trying to sort of improve for 20 years. And it's just a very, very tough problem.
Fair enough on that one. Did Seth or Doris want to add anything on that? No worries. There's another question on what effect will the BRI have on food security, if at all? And I might bring in Seth here in terms of looking at the ways different countries have responded to food security during COVID-19 compared to China, and whether there is any relationship with China's food security and the BRI based on that.
Sure, that's kind of a complicated question. The BRI is primarily, an infrastructure, a massive infrastructure system project. But of course, there will be implications for food security as well. That's something that we're quite interested in the Food and Land Use Coalition. One of the key issues with regard to not just BRI, but trade relations and COVID is when you have a crisis like COVID, and we saw this in the 2008-2009 food crisis as well, you start to see export bans. So countries restricting exports in order to basically ensure their own food security. And that becomes very problematic for importing countries. For China, Darin, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that's going to be such a huge issue. But then, when you have a country like Egypt, which relies on rice imports from Vietnam, if Vietnam starts to put in place export restrictions, that's hugely disruptive. We saw the same thing in the 2008-2009 situation. So this is, the whole issue of keeping trade open is extremely important.
Great. Did Darin or Doris, if you have anything to add, let me know. Okay, no worries. I'm going to sort of combine a couple of questions here, mainly towards you, Doris, about plant-based consumption and sort of understanding what are the key drivers behind that movement, and is health and safety a reason for a sort of a change in that consumption? I think you touched on it a little earlier.
Sure. So I think the motivation to consuming or buying plant-based alternative is different in China and in the West. So plant-based alternative is a relatively new product category in China. I would say maybe just since last year, and we have seen from surveys that, like for example, in the U.S., people would buy plant-based alternative to meat because of, for example, environmental impact of meat and so on. But then in China, we have seen in surveys that mostly because of, for example, like low calorie or 0 calorie of like plant-based alternative or the potential health benefits are reasons why consumers are drawn to like plant-based alternative. But environmental impact of meat is just relatively smaller factor for them to purchase these products. And sorry, what was your second question? There are 3 of them.
I think it was about, yes, if whether the concern for health and safety is a big driver now.
As for now, because I briefly mentioned that the consumers' awareness on food safety on conventional meat has already increased in after the outbreak, And also because of the really recent new outbreak in Beijing that is originated in seafood and in markets, and especially in area where the seafood are being located. We have seen also worries over, like, for example, seafood productions, seafood consumptions in China right now. But I guess it's too early to say whether like consumers will be adopting plant-based or like alternative, like to substitute meat on a large scale because of this. But then we have seen like people in general, consumers awareness on this issue have definitely increased, and that's also how these plant-based companies have been trying to leverage on to market their products, and we also guess that's the reason why there are these big launches in March once the virus is more or less stabilized here.
Yeah, I agree. It will be interesting to see if the new trends that people adopt during this sort of COVID era will last into the long term when the virus is gone. But I want to move on to a couple of questions about the swine fever. So we have Sheena and Sam, who are both asking about the impact of the swine disease in China. I think probably other than in terms of the trade, which we heard from Darin, and the increase in trade from Brazil because of that. But are there sort of fears or about recurrent outbreaks and the possibility of those continuing? I wonder, maybe Darin, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, I mean, so African swine fever has been around since about 2018. It spread pretty far within China. I think at the sort of worst part, you know, the losses in terms of the hog herd were about 50 to 60% estimated by sort of the private industry, which had basically led to a very massive increase in pork prices, which have, it's gone down a little bit in recent months as the government's tried to sort of restock the herd and get into more commercial farming ventures. But prices are still very elevated. There hasn't been too much, I think, consumer pushback against pork. It's been a very difficult disease to eradicate. We've still had outbreaks. Even about 2 months ago, we had an outbreak on a farm of nearly 10,000 hogs, which at that scale, they should have, very good biosecurity, but they're still being affected. There hasn't been too much pushback. Like Doris said, there was the recent outbreak at Xinfandi in Beijing. So there is this increased push in the past couple of days even about pork and about imported seafood and imported meat, because these places that are exporting, Brazil, the US, Europe, all have major outbreaks at all these meat plants. That's all getting put in containers at -18°C, and 2 weeks later it's opened in China. Now, whether or not COVID can transfer that way, we don't really know. But given that there's this outbreak at this very big wholesale market that deals with a lot of imported meat in Beijing, the government is checking very aggressively, and we'll have to wait and see what they find.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been reading about various outbreaks that are occurring in abattoirs around different countries. So definitely the correlation with COVID and meat production is quite a scary one. Someone is asking on the chat here if anyone has a comment on GMO foods in China in terms of regulations and public acceptance, as there's been quite a lot of debate about that.
Maybe I can just kick it off, and Darin probably has more to say on this. So I was recently asking one of our fellow ambassadors, Professor Fen Shagun of China Agriculture University, about this. He says there's a lot of research going on now on GM, rice, fruits, and other crops. Not just GMOs, but also gene editing. But GMO crops are only in experimental fields right now, not in actual farms. They are preparing for that. Yeah, so I think the scale is fairly small in terms of what's actually being done, but a lot of research. However, when you look at the imports, I mean, the GM, the soybeans that are imported from Brazil and US are GMOs. So, even if you're not consuming them directly, you are consuming them through the animals like pork that's being grown with GMO feed.
Yeah, I would just second that. that's why in part China has, very specific domestic GMO soybean industry that's used for, human consumption, whereas, everything imported that is GMO, imported GMO stuff goes to animal feed. It's very similar to the US, honestly. Scientifically, there's not really a good basis to avoid GMO food. But I think, consumers in the US and China are very similar. They both sort of generally try to avoid GMO food.
Thank you for that. I think continuing on about consumer preferences, there's a couple of questions about the increase in the number of vegans and vegetarians, and wondering, Doris, if you have any insights on whether that's gaining popularity in China as much as it is around the Western world.
Sure. So there hasn't been a comprehensive survey on I
think we might have temporarily lost you again. Sorry, Doris. We might come back to your answer in a minute. Yes, following on from that, Sheena is asking if you have any comment on the issue of COVID in wet market surfaces in Beijing, specifically where imported salmon from Norway was processed. I think we talked a little bit about, we don't know how well that can travel, but Seth, did you have something to add on that?
Yeah, I don't think we know enough yet to say, what the origins of that spread in the market were. Was it actually from the foods that were sold there, or was it the fact that this is a crowded space where many people are congregating in close quarters that can easily spread? Someone that had COVID then, was spreading it to other people. So, there's been kind of a backlash against wet markets globally because of COVID. And to my mind, this may not be so appropriate. What really should be implicated is the wildlife trade, because most likely COVID did originate. We don't know exactly from which species, but from the wildlife trade. And many other diseases have also originated from the wildlife trade as well.
Great. Just checking if Doris is back. Maybe not yet. That's okay. There's a question about what are the underexplored potential ways to increase China's resilience for food security in the face of possible future outbreaks of pandemics like this. So are there any other underexplored potential ways?
If Doris wants to kick in on this, she can. Maybe I can just say a few words on it. One obvious alternative is to encourage more plant-based diets, because so many diseases like COVID are spread by animals. So cutting down on meat consumption can help alleviate the threat, as well as help meet climate targets and the need for environmental quality. The whole issue, I think, Cameron, you guys covered this, the issue of wildlife markets in one of your previous talks, which unfortunately I missed. But it's important to realize that there are many cases of zoonotic diseases originating in wildlife. The devastating 1918 flu that killed between 50 and 100 million people also originated in birds. HIV, Ebola, MERS, SARS all came from the leap from wildlife to humans. So really cracking down on the wildlife trade, I think, is probably maybe the most important factor in terms of curbing the spread of these diseases like COVID. Interestingly, it's not an easy matter in China, because there's many wealthy, well-connected people that are involved in the business, and it tends not to be ordinary people who consume wildlife species, but rather wealthy people in many parts of the country. So it's not just about the trade, it's also about cultivation. Like civets today are still grown in China as a food source. Maybe Doris wants to kick in on this as well. Is Doris back?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Should I answer to this question first, or answer to the last question first?
Whatever you prefer.
Okay, maybe the last one before I forget. So About the number of vegans and vegetarians. So in China, we don't know the exact population of vegan or vegetarians, but that we have seen increasing number of like vegan restaurants or restaurants that are catering for like vegan options. And
oh, I think we've lost Doris again. No worries. I have a question.
Cameron, maybe I can just say a word about that. I think someone in the chat mentioned, we haven't touched upon this yet, that China has a long and venerable tradition of vegetarianism itself. And that, has tended to arise from the temple culture, Taoism and Buddhism in particular. In fact, when you go to a temple, they will often have a restaurant and it's going to be completely vegetarian. And it's, at least in my experience, amazing food. So that, that indigenous culture of vegetarian cuisine is very, very important, and it's something that China can build upon. I mean, for many Chinese people, it's not a full-time thing to be a vegetarian, but certain parts of, certain holidays or parts of the year, they do eat vegetarian food. So that, traditional roots are important.
Yeah, very true. I mean, I think, yeah, someone had just mentioned that in the chat about the way Buddhism promotes vegetarianism, also an important factor in considering the overall consumer trends in China. Darin, I had a quick question for you. Recently, there has been the imposition of tariffs on barley imports from Australia. And I think as an Australian, I'm curious to hear what your impression of that is in terms of the food security situation in China. Is that purely a political move, or will that have a big impact on food supplies?
Yeah, it won't really have much of an impact on food supplies. So the imported barley is generally used either if it's low quality for animal feed, but that's, a couple million tons a year compared to China's production of wheat and corn, which is hundreds of millions of tons. The other use for that is for beer. Now, there's also alternatives there. China can import from the Ukraine, they can import from Europe. When it comes to sort of the WTO and the regulations, China has a lot of leeway. For any of these countries, especially let's say Canada or Australia, for something like canola or for barley, that might, the barley trade for Australia, China's going to be the biggest exporter, or sorry, the biggest sort of buyer. So it's an incredibly important market for Australia. But for China, it's, a small piece of the overall pie. And China can get rid of Australian barley without many repercussions domestically, whereas Australia can't really lose China because it's such a big piece of their exports. But, within the WTO, China has a lot of flexibility when it comes to sort of non-tariff barriers, everything from phytosanitary certifications to extra inspections. There's a lot that China can do if they don't want a certain grain to flow. That's perfectly acceptable under WTO rules. And if there is some political tension, I'm sure they're happy to sort of use that to their advantage.
Indeed. Doris, well, thanks for reconnecting. We're about at time now, so I'll just give you the floor if you wanted to finish any of your previous comments.
I'm a bit scared of my internet right now, so I just type my answer in the chat box so everyone can see. Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you. Well, then that's perfect timing for us to wrap up. I wanted to thank you all, Darin, Doris, and Seth, for joining us today and for giving us your insights into food security, into food trade, into new food preferences, and the changes that are being undertaken in China. It was very informative, and I really appreciate your time.
Yep. Thanks for organizing, Cameron.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah. Thanks, Cameron, for organizing.
Thanks for joining. All right. Have a great weekend.